To make my point clear, let us compare the law's very narrow four-part standard for severe mental suffering with the CIA's actual practice of psychological torture to see which, if any, of the agency's techniques are banned under the new law. Now, under this law, Section 2340, there are only 4 practices that constitute in any way severe mental pain. In other words, what's severe mental pain? I'll tell you. It's these 4 things and nothing else, okay? 4 things, okay? What are they? Drug injection, death threats, threats against another, and extreme physical pain. In actual practice, this definition does not ban any of the dozens of CIA and now military intelligence psychological methods developed over the past 5 decades, which I detailed in this talk, but let me just recapitulate here very briefly, just so we get an idea of what's not included. First, self-inflicted pain by enforced standing or so-called stress positions, which are cruel contortions enforced by shackling, those we saw in that video. Second, sensory disorientation through temporal and environmental manipulation, exemplified by sleep deprivation, protracted isolation, and extremes of heat and cold, light and dark, noise and silence, isolation, and intensive interrogation. Third, attacks on cultural identity through sexual humiliation and use of dogs. Fourth, attacks on individual psyche by exploiting fears and phobias. Fifth, hybrid methods such as waterboarding. And sixth, and most importantly, creative combination of all these methods which might seem individually banal, if not benign. If you wish an analogy to make the curious, the Alice in Wonderland, curious logic of this legislation perfectly clear, would be as if U.S. homicide law had taken a leaf from the popular board game Clue. And given my audience, I must ask, does everybody here know Clue? Okay? Okay. You're academics, I assume, and like most of us, we kind of tend to miss things out there in the kind of ordinary cultural life. Okay, Clue, good, that's terrific. I guess it's a board game, can be played safely at home between working on our footnotes. It would be as if U.S. homicide law had taken this leaf from the board game Clue and defined murder as only those killings done by Mrs. White in the conservatory with the candlestick, thereby legalizing all murders done by more conventional means such as poison, pistols, rifles, knives, ropes, clubs, or bombs. To test my critical, I might even say overly critical assessment, let us ask whether this new law bans the most extreme of the CIA's enhanced methods, waterboarding. While the White House has refused comment, Vice President Cheney stated last October that using a dunk in water to extract information was, quote, a no-brainer for me. As the administration's leader on interrogation policy, Vice President Cheney's words make clear, despite White House denials, that waterboarding is legal under the new law. By its omissions, this legislation, the Military Commission Act 2006, has effectively legalized the CIA's right to use methods that the international community, embodied in the Red Cross and the UN Human Rights Committee, considers psychological torture. For the first time in the 200 years since 1791, when the United States ratified the Fifth Amendment banning self-incrimination. Why do we ban self-incrimination? Why would anybody in the 18th century self-incriminate? Why did it need to be banned? Because if you were tortured, you would self-incriminate. So the ban on self-incrimination was not, in fact, invented so that Tony Soprano, or his real-life equivalents, could stand up in front of the U.S. Congress or U.S. courts and say, I take the Fifth Amendment. No, it was introduced to ban torture from the U.S. judicial process. That's the point of the Fifth Amendment. The implications of the Military Commission's law are thus profound, and they are facing legal challenge. But when this case reaches the Supreme Court, we cannot expect that the Roberts Court will overturn this law with the same ringing rhetoric that we saw in those 2 recent landmark decisions, Rasool v. Bush and Hamdan v. Rumsfeld. If this law stands with its provisions for torture and drug justice, then the United States will suffer continuing damage to its moral leadership in the international community. Looking through a glass darkly into the future, Washington may return to that convenient Cold War contradiction, public compliance with human rights treaties, and secret torture and contravention of those same international conventions. Yet the world is no longer blind to these once clandestine CIA methods, and this attempt at secrecy will likely produce another scandal similar to Abu Ghraib. And next time our protestations of innocence will ring hollow, and the damage to U.S. prestige, the damage to this great nation's moral leadership will be even greater than the last time. Let me now conclude with some ethical reflections. If I were asked to stand back from our current debate over torture and draw some broad ethical conclusions, I do tentatively because I'm no expert on this, but you asked me, so I'll answer. You invited me, so here I am. I would argue that the past has lessons for our present. Let us return to that figure of Henry Dr. Henry K. Beecher, whom we last saw, as we will recall, traveling through Europe in 1951, trying to recruit European scientists and U.S. military officers for the CIA's massive mind control project. Why does everyone here today, indeed every academic researcher in America, live in Dr. Beecher's shadow? Mr. Banke, can you tell us who Henry K. Beecher is and why we live in his shadow? Do you know? Did you know? Have you heard of Beecher? What's your title at APA? Ethics office. And why does the APA have an ethics office? Henry K. Beecher. Okay. Why is there a human subjects protocol? Why are there institutional review boards? Why do we have informed consent for subjects? Henry K. Beecher. Indeed, Dr. Beecher is remembered for his famed 1966 article, Ethics in Clinical Research for the New England Journal of Medicine, which cited 22 incidences of morally dubious medical research conducted without regard for the welfare of human subjects. Dr. Beecher warned that we were at risk for this abuse of the subjects becoming universal in practice of clinical research. 4 years later, Beecher expanded upon these ideas in his book, Research and the Individual, drawing upon the cautionary example of the Nazi doctors tried at Nuremberg to argue, quote, in medicine, the first rule is to do no harm. If serious risk is to be taken, however, this can often be limited to the situation where the subject, a patient, promises to profit directly from it. When serious risk is to be taken for the sake of science alone, the welfare of the subject is paramount, end quote. It's from page 181 of his book. Initially controversial, and it was enormously controversial at the time, Beecher's study, Beecher's accusations, launched the establishment of institutional review boards and made his name synonymous with informed consent and the ethical treatment of human subjects, a legacy commemorated with the annual award of the Henry K. Beecher Prize in Medical Ethics at Harvard Medical School, given to the student who writes the best essay on medical ethics. He's an exemplar for the future doctors and clinical researchers of America. Typical of the laudatory treatment of Beecher's career, a 2001 article in the Bulletin of the World Health Organization explained that Beecher's, quote, deep Christian faith and some guilt over ethical lapses in his lab, perhaps, inspired him to sound the warning that breaches of ethical conduct are almost universal in medical research.